Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert, and today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with a study of Josef Pieper's Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. So who is Josef Pieper? Josef Pieper is a 20th century philosopher. I would call him one of the greatest teachers in the 20th century. And we'll see why in these episodes where we look at one of his essays, Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. Pieper was German. He lived through the Nazi regime in Germany. And we'll see that although his focus tends to be very metaphysical and somewhat ethical, he does bring in political concepts. And in fact, I think he tends to frame his essays with political concepts so that although he doesn't usually have extended commentary on politics, he's always showing how what he's talking about is relevant to the political reality and past, present, and future. So he's raising a lot of questions about modern political life, but he's trying to dig into the metaphysical and ethical foundations. His most famous work is Leisure, the Basis of Culture. This was originally published in 1948, so it was just after World War II, and the time when Germany and Europe had to rebuild, and so everyone was focused on work. And in that essay, he famously examines the nature of leisure, which is a classical concept really lost in modern philosophy. And as he probes into how and why it has been lost and why that matters, we could connect this very much in this course, although we're not reading that work, to, for example, Machiavelli's War on Fortune. In Machiavelli's thought, nature is something to be conquered and mastered and controlled. And as we've seen in classical thought, although it's fine for us to work on nature and transform, natural things, make them suitable for human use, that's not the purpose of human existence. In fact, the purpose of our existence comes from a contemplation and an understanding of the order of things. So if our attitude towards reality is one of domination and conquest, we can't receive that understanding of the order, which should then guide our decisions. And so leisure is actually the concept that describes the receptive aspect of the human intellect and the human soul, receiving reality itself, the order of things, which then becomes the basis of work and of the virtues as we've been focusing on in this course. So that's the focus of his most famous work, and justly so. It's a classic. But we're going to look at an essay that he wrote in the 1970s. And this is because in that essay, he's looking at a theme that is even more directly related to our other readings in this course. He's looking at the use or the abuse of language. And so he's going to reference Gorgias and reference Plato's critique of the sophists. And he's using the term sophist in a broad sense that would include rhetoric, and Gorgias, the rhetorician. And he's looking at how this is connected to the abuse of language and the abuse of power. So in other words, this connection between the ethical problems with speaking untruthfully or manipulatively and political phenomena such as tyranny versus, of course, a just society. So what is the role of language and truth in pursuing truth? How is that connected to a just society? So, of course, that is the theme of this course, and we're going to take a look at what Pieper has to say about that. And he's going to bring that all up to date into, in this case, the late 20th century. So we'll easily be able to see how all these things connect to the world that we're in right now. So to begin with, Pieper gives us a little orientation. This is something that we could use for this course as a whole and our approach that we take to reading the various different philosophers in this kind of course. I intend to approach this subject from two different directions. And the first is going to be looking at an historical figure and author, Plato. We've already looked at him as well in this course. And he's going to focus on Plato's lifelong battle with the sophists. He now gives us, for the reader who may not be familiar, or for those who want to see what is his interest in this all about, he characterizes the sophists. He calls them those highly paid and popularly applauded experts in the art of twisting words, who were able to sweet talk something bad into something good and to turn white into black. So he's going to expand on that in this essay, but we already see the basic point here is that there's an abuse of language, and that's what is definitive of sophistry as he understands Plato's critique of sophistry, is a critique of those who twist words to turn things upside down, to make things into the opposite of what they are. And particularly, you can see the good and bad, what the relevance of that is. If we're trying to do good, we're trying to live a good life, having somebody persuade us that what is bad is really good is a major problem. Well, what's the second angle that he's taking on this? The first one is to understand Plato's critique. But then the second part comes in. The case could be made that Plato recognized, identified, and battled in the sophistry of his time a danger and a threat besetting the pursuits of the human mind and the life of society in any era. So as I mentioned, Pieper is going to bring Plato up to date and apply him to the contemporary world. And that may be a very particular service. I think it's one of the signs of Pieper's greatness as a teacher is that he is he's so deft at being able to bring any concept that you want from ancient world or medieval world into the modern world and just show how it's there. But how is he able to do that? I mean, I think he's hinting at it right here is that these concepts and these arguments are universal in nature. They're not actually bound to any time period. So while we may be used to thinking in terms of time periods and sometimes have trouble toggling from one to another, Pieper is looking at things, and in this course we're tending to look at things which are really not fundamentally connected. I want to say, and actually when they are, to the extent they are, I would say it's almost the other way around. Not that the ideas are coming from the time period or they're only relevant in that time period, but rather that these are ideas which can shape time periods. That is, depending on which way society goes with these ideas, it can turn the world into a very different kind of place. So in any case, these ideas are accessible at any time and any place, and they're highly relevant, but they are going to show up in different ways, of course. So it is very useful to have somebody who's very perceptive at seeing how do they show up in the modern world. Well, before Pieper gets into showing us that, he elaborates a little bit, and he's doing some interesting things here that I want to take a look at. He says the timeless character of the sophistic phenomenon, transcending any particular age, prompted certain important, indeed disturbing comments by Hegel. Now, who is Hegel? Hegel is a major philosopher. He was writing in the early 1800s, overlaps with Napoleon Bonaparte, of whom he had some important comments. And Hegel is the source is one of the major sources of what we could call historicism, which is the idea that the historical period we in really determines what the truth is for us, that truth is something that shifts with historical time periods. So it's deeply ironic that Pieper is going to cite Hegel to make exactly the opposite point. He's going to cite Hegel as a source of this kind of timeless wisdom, a timeless observation about things. It's a very deliberate thing that he's doing there. He's being friendly to Hegel in a sense, saying, hey, Hegel has this insight into things, but it's a type of insight that actually goes against the fundamental thesis that Hegel is trying to promote. Another dimension to this is that Hegel can be looked at as a sort of prototype of Marx. And of course, we know that Marx is almost a definitive figure on the left, or the radical left, and a source of kind of radical progressive thought, which we've already looked, we've taken a little peek into what that's about, and we'll look at it a little bit more later in the course. Now, Hegel can be associated with both left and right politically in terms of those who were employing his thought, but he was actually a major influence on 20th century progressivism. And so the point that, if we follow the point that Pieper is making here, there's additional irony in how he is looking at Hegel. To quote Hegel, "You need not have advanced very far in your learning in order to find good reasons even for the most evil of things." So he's making a connection between learning and this corruption of language, abuse of language. What is that connection? The more educated you are, then the better able you are to abuse language. So we'll follow this a little bit further and then kind of comment on that. Hegel, therefore, sees here a danger clearly intrinsic to the human mind, being part of its nature. So the more we're developing our mind through education, then the more potential we have to abuse what we're learning. And so it's intrinsic to the human mind, this danger, a danger that can perhaps be overcome but never entirely avoided. So if we think about that, for each individual, it's always a risk as we pursue education and development of our mind, how we choose to use that. So historically speaking, which again is the focus of philosophers like Hegel, looking at historical eras, can you really lock them into particular ways of thinking? And particularly, can you argue that there is some kind of historical progress that is inevitable taking place when the whole process of educating people every generation is a bit of a wild card? What are they going to do with that education? How are they going to use that? It's not really controllable from this advantage of historical periods. Who could control that, right? And this danger could become all the more threatening the more highly man's power of judgment, that is, his mental formation, is perfected. So you notice how this doesn't completely destroy the concept of progress. It doesn't mean that there can't be any kind of progress in society, but it does drastically limit that concept because there is no vantage from which we can control the education and the use of that education and essentially the hearts of all these people from one generation to the next. For each person in each generation, there is an adventure going on here. What are we going to learn and how are we going to use that? So again, Hegel, on the whole, is not focused on these kinds of things. He's focused on the broad sweep of history and trying to find some kind of scientific basis for history's moves in certain directions. But Pieper hones in here and says, well, even Hegel bears witness to the reality of what we're going to talk about, which ironically places drastic limits on his own philosophy of history. So what is the problem with sophistry? What exactly is going on here? Why is it harmful? What's motivating it? These are the kinds of questions that Pieper is going to start with. And he says, to begin with, we notice the fact that these men are exceptionally successful, which every now and then prompts a sardonic admiration on the part of Socrates. So looking at Plato for our initial framework, Socrates is ironic and he says even sardonic regarding the success of people like Gorgias. Socrates always starts when he's questioning people with kind of building them up and saying, oh, you're clearly wise, you clearly know something. But then as they try to explain it, he starts poking holes in it and shows that they really don't seem to know as much as they appeared to know. And we saw that happen with Gorgias as well as his students. So Socrates, but they're successful even though they have these holes in their thinking. So what's the relationship there? He notices this merchandising of wisdom, this disregard of the essential difference between money and the spirit. This is going to come up repeatedly. That wisdom is not something that, as he's going to say later, is commensurable with money or other units of wealth or power. In other words, having more money doesn't make you wiser. And if you have more money, you can't buy wisdom with it, right? There's no, you can't measure wisdom with money, and you can't make wisdom with money or buy it with money, etc. So there's an incommensurability between money and the spirit, but this is ignored by sophists. It's really definitive of sophistry that it's a merchandising of wisdom. So they're charging big bucks for their speeches and teaching people how to make these speeches. And that is, in essence, the purpose of their speaking. You know, the better the speech, the more money you make, or the more money you make, the better the speech was, is kind of the attitude that a sophist has. So it's a fundamentally different attitude from Socrates, but it's a fundamentally flawed attitude, because if the purpose of speech is truth or wisdom, that's not the right way to measure speech. So we're getting into why this is abusive, right? But also why people would be attracted to it. If it's abusive, why would people do it? Well, there's a big payoff, right? There's a payoff for abusing language. That's one of the reasons this is a perennial problem. This is not a problem that's ever going to go away. There's a constant temptation here. And he says this, ignoring this incommensurability between wisdom and money, as if there were no difference between what used to be called the liberal arts and what we now call mental work. So that is a big gripe that we see in his earlier essay, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, that the concept of the liberal arts is really being abandoned in modern society, and in favor of the idea that everything that has value is work, or somehow related to work. So we could see this, for example, today in just how higher education, which used to be focused on liberal arts, and to some extent still may have those in there, that it's increasingly de-emphasized in most cases, and it's packaged or marketed in terms of job skills or job training or career preparation. But it goes much deeper than that. There would just be one little indication of the general attitude. And we can see he's going to close this essay with talking about academia, which we'll get to later, and we'll come back to how relevant that is if we reinterpret academia in these terms. What exactly is at stake there? But here it concludes the point by saying, as if there were no difference between the honorarium, but an honorarium and wages. So he's going to dig into that just a little bit more. The idea of an honorarium is basically it's paying somebody for something that has no market value or monetary value. Now, why would you do that? The basic reason, if something has value for society, for example, the pursuit of truth is beneficial for the common good of society, but the truth being pursued doesn't have a market value, then the purpose of an honorarium is to allow somebody to dedicate his or her life to the pursuit of truth and still be able to survive. So calling that wages or trying to compute that in terms of wages is a problem, not because it's wrong to pay people to pursue truth, but because it's wrong to think or imply or assert that truth can be measured by money. So Pieper points out here that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with somebody like himself, for example, a professor of philosophy, earning a salary to teach philosophy. But what exactly is wrong about, connecting money and wisdom? What would that look like to do that wrongly? And he gives an example from another dialogue of Plato, the Cratylus dialogue, which incidentally also discusses the problem of language, he mentions. And it deals with a certain question that for us here is of no consequence, and Socrates remains silent. So a certain particular question comes up. Socrates doesn't have anything to say. So they ask him, and what do you think, Socrates? To which he replies, I have no opinion on this, for I could afford only the 5 drachma lecture of Prodicus, one of those great sophists. His 50 drachma lecture I could not afford. Had I been able to, then perchance I might be knowledgeable. Here, Pieper says, the crucial point is made loud and clear. So what is the crucial point? He's implying this, I think it's important to note that a good teacher often does not spell things out and lets us, think about them and sort of answer for ourselves. So he's giving us, a contrast. The honorarium is, a payment to somebody who is dedicating his time to pursuing truth and sharing that with others to enable him to have that time to do it. Right? But the honorarium is not trying to reduce the truth down to a monetary value. Well, what difference does that make in practice? This would be an example of the difference that it could make. Socrates says, I couldn't afford the more expensive lecture, and therefore I don't know the answer. So that implies Prodicus was not willing to share his wisdom unless somebody paid for it. And it was, per unit of wisdom, like whatever the question was that they were talking about. If you want the answer to that question, then you have to pay for it. So he's suggesting that there is a radical attitudinal difference between somebody who is pursuing truth and willing to share this, but needs some compensation, versus somebody who is pursuing, whether it's truth or not, they're pursuing something that is marketable, and they are charging a price, per unit of knowledge or information. But still, we could say, okay, what's the big deal here, right? Because people are willing to pay for it, so it must be good, right? There must be something good there. And especially in the modern world, commercial society, we have all kinds of logic around, copyrights and stuff like that, which we're trying to encourage people, to do good work. So we make it, possible for them to profit from it. So what exactly is the threat? Pieper is now going to be, sort of one layer at a time, digging into exactly what is wrong with this picture. The specific threat for Plato comes from the sophist's way of cultivating the word with exceptional awareness of linguistic nuances and utmost formal intelligence, from their way of pushing and perfecting the employment of verbal constructions to crafty limits, thereby, and precisely in this, corrupting the meaning and the dignity of the very same words. So this is a very paradoxical element of his argument, because he talks about perfectionism. He says perfectionism is not the same thing as perfection. And this is one of those places where extremely subtle distinction can make a huge difference. Perfection is actually trying to be as good as possible, whatever that thing is. And if we're talking about human life, trying to be the best human being possible, that would be perfection. But perfectionism is something else. And since it is something else, it's not true perfection. It's not what is truly good. So it goes back to the Machiavellian distinction between being and appearance. When Machiavelli says you want to appear to be just, you want to appear to be pious, you want to appear to be humane and so forth, but you don't want to be those things. You want to be something else. You're actually underneath the surface. You're doing something different. And so that's what is going on here, is that the sophists create an appearance of perfection. They have so much skill with words and how they craft their words. And they do this to the point where they're actually corrupting the meaning and the dignity of those words. So they are unconcerned with the substance of what they're saying. They're so focused on how it sounds, how it looks. So it's all about cultivating a sort of virtual reality, and that's where this argument is going to go eventually. That sophistry is really trying to create a verbal, and not just verbal, but fundamentally a verbal alternate reality, which everything appears to be perfect and good, but it is not rooted on an actual reality, the actual meaning, the actual dignity, the actual good. As he said earlier, it's turning what is bad into good, or pretending what is bad is actually good. So, what is being corrupted? Language is being corrupted. Well, what exactly is the significance of language? Here, Pieper looks at, he says there's a twofold purpose to language, as Plato, without doubt, would have answered, in clear agreement with the entire tradition of Western thought. So Pieper's starting to expand a little bit here and indicate that it goes beyond Plato, of course. We looked at Plutarch, and we're going to look at St. Thomas Aquinas. So we're going to see a little bit of that arc of how these Platonic ideas developed and were embodied in different thinkers and in different systems of thought throughout history. But since this accomplishment is twofold, what language accomplishes, we may already here suspect that the words degeneration and corruption can also be twofold. So there's, in other words, two things that are being undermined by sophistry. First, words convey reality. We speak in order to name and identify something that is real, to identify it for someone, of course. And this points to the second aspect in question, the interpersonal character of human speech. So you see here we have two things which in the title of the course would be truth and justice. The first purpose of words is to allow us to encounter reality. That's the truth, the correspondence between our mind and reality, and words help us to achieve this. But for whom are we doing this? We're obviously doing it for ourselves, but words are not only necessary for our own thinking, but words are necessary for communicating with others. And so through the word as a central feature of human nature, it means that we have an obligation towards the truth, but we also have an obligation to communicate truthfully and therefore justly with others. Expanding a little bit on this point, Pieper observes, of course, there's also the possibility of lying, of falsifying. A lie is the opposite of communication. It means specifically to withhold the other's share and portion of reality, to prevent his participation in reality. And so corruption of the relationship to reality and corruption of communication, these evidently are the two possible forms in which the corruption of the word manifests itself. So language exists for the sake of truth and justice. And if we're using language with ulterior motives, we're seeking instead money or power, fame, those kinds of things. This is going to have a corrupting effect on how we speak. But of course, if it was obvious that that's what we're doing, then it wouldn't actually accomplish anything. The sophist can be popular, the sophist can be influential, precisely because we do not necessarily detect the fact that they are being untruthful. Right? So the same problem that we saw in Plutarch's How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend, that Pieper is wrestling with a different version of that problem in this critique of the sophists. At a sort of public discourse level, you're looking at who is really your friend in the public sphere, who is really guiding you in the direction of truth, versus who is corrupting language to say things that sound good and sound persuasive, but are actually untruthful. So since we're expounding, idea from Plato, Pieper keeps going back to Plato, and in this case he goes to Gorgias, which we read. And he says Gorgias is, of course, a historical figure. And so he mentions, going outside the dialogue, that we do know some of the opening sentences of his writings. We don't have his, as Tocqueville mentioned, we don't have the complete works of Gorgias and people like this, but we have some fragments. And the very first sentence states that nothing is. This Gorgias does not by any means intend to deny the existence of countless facts that lead to even more countless news reports and commentaries. So denying that anything is, or denying that there is any such thing as truth, is not necessarily a denial of facts or information, the kinds of things that get reported on in the news and commentaries. And this is an important placeholder because he will be looking at where do we see sophistry in the modern world. And spoiler alert, news reports and commentaries would be an example of that. So we'll get to that. But he's also going to talk about how information is not the same thing as wisdom or knowledge. And being inundated with information, even apart from the question of whether the information is false, even if it's not false, it doesn't mean that we know the truth based on having this flood of information in front of us. So what Gorgias is saying, according to Pieper, in denying the existence of anything per se, he does intend to say is this: there is no such thing as being endowed, as it were, with normative authority that the one who speaks would have to respect or would be able to respect. So there's no moral truth. There's nothing with normative authorities, nothing that sets the difference between right and wrong and good and bad. It's a kind of moral relativism, which we saw in Gorgias and his students, thinking that if they can satisfy their desires, then that's what matters in life, and being indifferent to the question of truth or justice, and only concerned about that subjective satisfaction. So these things could be presented as relatively, innocent, sort of, friendly or happy relativism that, well, there's no truth, but we don't really need it. As long as people are happy and satisfied, that's fine. But as we saw in the Gorgias, which again, Pieper goes back to the Gorgias, Socrates compels Gorgias to admit that such sophisticated language, disconnected from the roots of truth, in fact pursues some ulterior motives, that it invariably turns into an instrument of power, something it has been by its very nature right from the start. So if you, as we saw in the Gorgias, if you are speaking with no reference to the truth, you don't really care about whether it's true or not, there must be a motivation. Your motivation is not truth. It must then be some form of power. That is the sort of alternative motive that you might have. You're trying to get people to think something is true. Notice that by trying to deceive people or persuade people, if you think, well, truth doesn't exist, but if you just blurt that out, that's not going to persuade anybody. Well, then nothing you say really matters, does it? Because there's no truth. So there's a deceptive element in thinking, well, there's no truth, but I'm going to speak as if something is true and get people to think that. Why would you care to do that? It must be, there are many different motives, particular motives, but it must be some ulterior motive, something other than fulfilling your own human nature or helping other people to fulfill their human nature. And so we'll close this episode with looking at Pieper's exposition of exactly how and why this is damaging to do this. The other person whom I try to influence with what he likes to hear ceases to be my partner. He is no longer a fellow subject. So this is his way of articulating what Plutarch had said about friendship and flattery. The flatterer is not our friend, because a friend is somebody who is standing on equal footing with the other person, particularly with respect to truth and justice and happiness. In other words, if I want the truth and I want what belongs to me and I want happiness, then if I want this for somebody else as well, then this is friendship. If, on the other hand, I don't care about whether they have the truth, they have what belongs to them, I don't care if they are happy or not, then there is no equality, there's no friendship. So rather, he, the sophist, has become, or the audience, has become for me an object to be manipulated possibly to be dominated, to be handled and controlled. So it's treating a person like a thing, like an object. And we saw in Gorgias that was really the essence of the critique of this, is that we're actually hurting ourselves by doing this because we are departing from reality. We're treating a human being like an object, which shows a disorder in our own intellect and will. But Pieper goes on, the situation is just about the opposite of what it appears to be. It appears, especially to the one so flattered, as if a special respect would be paid, while in fact this is precisely not the case. So we'll see more about this in the next episode when we get into examples. But the essence of what a sophist is doing, again, is representing something as true, which is not. And here, the aspect of that he looks at is that it's representing this as if it is for your good. So it could simply be praising you or making you feel like you're being praised, so making you feel like you are good, but untruthfully in a way that's not actually identifying something good about you. Remember, Plutarch had talked about praising somebody's vices. That would be an example, and Pieper will use that example a little bit later. So it's a distortion of the truth about, particularly about the person that is receiving these words, and it's getting them to have a false sense of themselves, which is why Plutarch said self-knowledge is the best defense against flattery, because then we can detect that somebody's being false about us if we know ourselves well. But this is contrary to human dignity, as Pieper points out. His dignity is ignored, but ironically, he may feel like his dignity is being upheld. That's the particular problem. Trying to make you feel good about yourself, but on a false basis, which means that it isn't your real good and it's not your real dignity. It's kind of a false dignity, counterfeit dignity, and a counterfeit good that sophistry is offering. I concentrate on his weaknesses and on those areas that may appeal to him, all in order to manipulate him, to use him for my own purposes. So we could see that this is all characteristic and even you could say essential to what sophistry or flattery is all about, is actually looking for the weak points in another person, and instead of correcting them or encouraging them to overcome those weaknesses, is precisely the opposite, trying to make them feel that those weaknesses are strengths, trying to make them feel good about that, with the purpose of manipulating this person and getting something out of them. So this all might sound quite familiar. Pieper is reviewing, Plato, and Plutarch was applying that. In the next episode, we're going to look at how Pieper where he finds this in the modern world, and how he's going to analyze that and try to help us to be better on our guard, but also to look at the particular dangers that this raises in the modern world.